So, you want to main Magneto. Magneto is a big, chunky tank with tons of ways to enable his team, a big meatball for an ultimate, Magneto! And he really only has one weakness: the Holocaust. Your fate. I have been no-lifing Marvel Rivals, primarily on Magneto, since the game dropped, and it got me well into One Above All, which is the top 500 players in the world. So here's my One Above All guide to Magneto, so you too can start popping off with this high-impact off-tank who not only enables his teammates and shuts down enemies, but has a lot of potential for individual outplays and carry as well. We're gonna start with abilities, details, and some useful use cases, and then we're gonna go over some strategy and tips. Let's dive into it. Starting off, there's of course Magneto's primary fire, Iron Volley. Hitting your primary fire shoots out a slow-moving projectile that deals a decent amount of damage on a direct hit. The projectile itself hits for some damage and then causes an explosion where it lands. The farther the projectile travels before exploding, the larger the explosion is. If the projectile doesn't hit anything and instead hits its max range, it will explode on its own with the maximum size of the explosion. The explosion itself deals significantly less damage the farther away the enemy is from its center. If we ignore the damage from the direct hit, damage on the outer edge of the explosion only ticks the target for half of what a direct hit would. At the time of this video, a direct hit slaps the target for 35 damage for the projectile and then an additional 40 for the explosion at the center. So at a direct hit, that would be 75 in total at the lowest end. Without a direct hit, it tickles for 20. If you're trying to target tons of enemies that are bunched together, then it makes sense to try to hit them at max range to maximize how much damage the explosion does to the individual target, but most importantly, the surrounding ones as the explosion gets larger. It's a pretty good primary fire to harass tanks, but I've found the most success with it in turning my focus from the tanks to the supports or other squishies that happens to be within my range, since you can fully kill them or get them very low with just a few shots, especially if it's combined with your secondary fire. And Magneto's secondary fire, Mag Cannon, lets you turn the slow, chunky damage into somewhat of a burst, and despite your generally shorter range, actually be able to snipe enemies across any range. It's also a great tool to create space and throw the enemy's positioning off in the middle of any hectic teamfights. The Mag Cannon collects charge to 3 different states, visible by this icon under your crosshair. At the time of this video, the first state deals 40 damage, the second deals 65 damage, and when fully charged, it will deal 90 damage. Make sure to pay attention to your charge if you are planning to use it, so you don't use it before you have unlocked the next state. The damage does not scale between the states, you actually need to get through each step if you want to upgrade it. When the Mag Cannon is at full charge, it also knocks the enemy back 6 meters on a direct hit. The enemy is fully stunned for the duration of the knockback, and they travel in a predictable arc, which means that anyone on your team can easily follow that up with free damage. It's also worth noting that the Mag Cannon has an infinite range and no damage fall off, so it is a perfect tool to snipe that low or mid-health enemy that might be running away. I've also recently made a bit of a habit of just throwing the Mag Cannon out onto any squishy or really any target I can whenever I hit full charge, because a direct hit with my Iron Volley, which is then followed up by the Mag Cannon, can be a burst of 165 damage, which can force enemies to make a mistake or just kind of die by any of my teammates' chip damage. It's obviously situational, but never using it at all and just holding onto it is a throw, because if I end up holding on to the Mag Cannon for an entire fight, I'm missing out on a lot of potential damage and displacements and ult charge that could have helped my team. There's also a million different ways that you can use the Mag Cannon. It really comes down to how creative you're feeling, with some of my favorite ones being the Mag Burst combo, which is simply a primary, secondary, primary combo. If you hit a direct hit on a squishy and then immediately use the Mag Cannon, this means that thanks to the trajectory that your second primary will shoot them into, which will make it super easy to land another primary fire onto them as well. So at the time of this video, the whole combo would deal 240 damage, meaning that if anyone else on your team as much as sneezes towards the squishy, or if they already have taken some damage, then they're going to die. I also like displacing a tank by throwing them into the side, behind a wall or cover, away from their healers and teammates, while also leaving their own backline exposed to my own DPS. Either the tanks die from lack of support while they are stuck, or the rest of the team dies from the free angles. You can also displace divers like Psylocke or Black Panther or Spider-Man by knocking them around when they dive in, and due to how squishy they are, they usually die from the focus afterwards. You can also use the Mag Cannon to take space. If we're walking up on a team, or especially if they're trying to walk up on us, I sometimes hit the tanks with the Mag Cannon to push one of them backwards. This can open a small window for damage, which can turn the pressure and the fight back in your favor. And while there are even more uses, another one I really like to mention is countering certain ultimates like Doctor Strange's with the Mag Cannon. Generally speaking, the Rescue Kit is a better way to counter Strange's ultimate ultimate. But if you are really far away and you see the strange ult coming, then you can knock him back from your team with the mag cannon. In most cases, he will be knocked too far back to actually hit anyone with it. I also want to mention that while the mag cannon does push an enemy back at full charge, this doesn't apply if the enemy is stuck in the ground or if mid animation. So you can throw the cannon at something like a Punisher turret or a flying Hela or an enemy hit by Doctor Strange without worrying that they get knocked back into safety. If anything, I dare say you should combine both your primary and secondary fire to burn these enemies much faster. The mag cannon will automatically charge over time or after his projected barrier takes damage. The projected barrier, also more commonly known as the bubble, is a defensive barrier that Magneto can apply to a teammate or to himself, and for those who need a distinction, the self-cast goes by the name of Iron Bulwark, and the one that applies to a teammate is called Metal Bulwark, so now you know. While these technically are two different abilities with two different buttons or keys, they actually share the same cooldown, meaning you can only have one of them active at a time. It is worth noting that unlike in some other games, as with most abilities in Marvel Rivals, there's a tiny animation that plays before the bubble appears on Magneto or on a teammate, so even if you react exactly when an enemy pulls something off that you might want to bubble off of, it might still go through if they connect before the bubble animation finishes. At the time of this video, the bubbles stay on the target for 2.5 seconds, or if the target takes 300 damage. There's no proper damage feedback on the bubbles, and most Overwatch players are programmed not to shoot the bubbles, so most of the time these go without breaking. At the time of this video, in Season 1, there is no way to deal damage to anyone within the bubbles. If your bubbled teammate has a mark over their head, like for example, like Panther's mark, which requires him to dash through an enemy to deal additional damage and activate it, or a Spider-Man who gets additional damage on targets that have the mark above them, then they won't actually be able to reap the benefits of the mark until the shield goes down. So this makes Magneto one of my favorite counters against these types of dive heroes, not only because the additional health, but because I cannot stop them from doing a full combo and die in my backline while looking like idiots. Additionally, no other effects pierce the bubbles either. This means that bubble targets can't receive any debuffs like stuns, damage amplifiers, sleeps, knockups, and more. As with any other shield, for all intents and purposes, you could consider the bubble a wall, although this one kind of moves around, and if you're in ranked, it might call you slurs. This might be obvious against some abilities, like if you're standing in front of an incoming bullet or something, but this also applies to line of sight abilities, most notably standing in between an ulting Doctor Strange or a 4 or Neymar. With your bubble up will not only stop you from getting hit by their ultimates, but it will also save anyone who might be behind you. And as I mentioned previously, incoming damage to these bubbles will charge up your secondary fire, Mag Cannon. Every 100 damage that these bubbles soak up give you 1 new charge on the cannon. It might feel a bit weird because you only get a full charge, also known as ring, every time you hit 100 damage threshold on the bubble. So despite you seeing damage hitting your bubbles, if an enemy deals 99 damage or below, it will grant no charge. And while that doesn't make a difference to your rings, hitting the like button on this video really does to mine, so do that. Charging up your mag cannon rings by placing the bubble on someone who's currently taking damage is a good way both to deny the enemy ult charge while also protecting your teammates, and of course giving yourself some nice damage with the mag cannon. But you shouldn't use the bubbles off of cooldown because they have a ton of uses, and unless you set plays up with the bubbles, then you usually need to use them reactively if you want to help someone in trouble. Personally, I do try to use them when they are off cooldown as much as I can, but I don't haphazardly throw it around. Currently, the bubble has a 12-second cooldown, so when it comes off of cooldown, I start looking around at my teammates to see if there's anyone who could need a bubble or so for the next few seconds. And if I don't find anyone who needs a bubble at all right now, or I just don't see an optimal use for it, I tend to hold on to it for a bit longer. But if I can save my teammates some health, or if I can get myself a little bit more mag cannon charge, I usually end up placing it, even if it might not be optimal if I don't think there's going to be something big happening within the next 12 seconds. Knowing when to use the bubble versus when you want to hold on to it is a constant balancing act, since using it does give you that immediate benefit through health, damage denial, and ult charge, but if it's on cooldown, then your teammates might end up dying without you being able to do anything. It is a very situational call, and there are a lot of variables that goes into what you should do. I suggest trying to think ahead. What do the enemies want to do next? What does your team want to do next? If your teammate is ulting, in most cases, it's a good idea to bubble them to ensure that the ult play goes off well. Bubbling a Star-Lord makes a lot of sense, but even bubbling a hero like Doctor Strange or Iron Man will stop them from getting stunned or killed when going for it. If the enemies are going to use certain ults, or you know they're diving specific targets, then you want to hold onto the shield so you can protect whoever is caught up by these ultimates or coordinated dives, aka priority targets. The nature of the bubble, and I guess Magneto in general, forces you to be the glue in every team fight, keeping your head on a swivel, constantly looking around, and staying very vigilant about everything happening around you, and having somewhat of an understanding about what's about to happen will let you figure out where your shield will be the most valuable. Most players, even in Eternity and One Above All, rarely expect Magneto to turn around and help the backline with shields and more, and so many fights are saved just from me turning around for 1 second and bubbling our Luna so the Black Panther can't one-shot her. Some good use cases for these bubbles can be, first, as I said, shielding a teammate in general. If you're in lower ranks, you'll probably get a lot more value out of shielding teammates that end up getting caught or overextend, because a lot of people are going to be overextending in the low-ranked lobbies. There's obviously not much of a reason to shield someone just because they're overextended, but keep an extra eye on these guys. And if you see them start taking damage or they start getting a lot of focus from the enemy team, then it's probably time to throw a barrier onto them. The additional bonus here is that the lower rank you're in, the more likely it is that your team is lacking damage. So using your shields often will give you your secondary fire charge much faster, which can help you offset the lack of damage in the team as well. Since cooldown management is the name of the game, waiting for as long as possible to use the bubble is generally key. If you can avoid needing to use it in one situation, then you can use it for something more valuable down the line. Again, it's a situational call and not a rule. Another thing I mentioned is, of course, shielding a teammate going for the ultimate. This is really underrated, and obviously you need to know what ult you're going to use ahead of time. So if you can't coordinate this, then keeping track of your own ultimates or just preparing to use your bubble when a teammate calls that they're going to ult can be good enough. While some ultimates really don't need bubbling, many of them are very risky to pull off without one. Combining ults with bubbles is something you should do more often than not. The riskier the ultimates, the more they will need the bubble and the higher the rewards. It can also counter tons of ultimates with the bubble. I mentioned that it stops practically every ultimate in the game, but not many know that the bubble also stops certain annoying abilities like Jeff's ultimate. So if Jeff solo ults you or a teammate, then you can just drop a bubble to save either of you. If Psylocke pops an ultimate on your team, then the bubble will absorb up to 2 hits during the ultimate. Due to the damage and the nature of the ultimate, you want to put the bubble on one of your squishies so they don't get 2 shots by it. I was going to say, since the ultimate only hits one target at a time in the same sequence, bubbling when it's their turn to be hit would be pretty effective, but I might be overcooking this tip since it is very situational. It depends on the amount of people within the ultimate, what the targets are, and what the sequence will be, but hey, if you guys want to try it out, let me know how it worked. In addition to these use cases, if I'm playing Magneto as an off-tank, so with a Doctor Strange frontlining with me, if my Doctor Strange starts pushing up or if starting to lose the shield fight with the enemy Doctor Strange pressuring him, I often throw a bubble onto Strange to give him a little bit of a respite from the constant pressure. Sometimes this is enough to turn the fight and give our frontline the advantage instead. When I combine that with the backline poke, it is usually enough to make a difference. Also, sometimes I use both the bubble and my square shield as a Magneto at the same time in very niche situations, like if a Strange jumps in my face and I suspect that he will ult, but I feel like there's a risk that he's gonna get around my shield or get through it and hit me and any nearby teammates. By bubbling myself, I would protect myself and anyone who is behind me, as well as the larger additional protection from my shield. If we get stuck in one position and we need to sustain a lot of damage, like let's say a Groot ult, and my shield doesn't quite cover everyone, or if I'm just out of a shield, I usually try to bubble whichever teammate is the closest to the enemy team. That turns my teammate into an impromptu shield for the rest of us. Bubbling the squishies works too, but like I said, it is so versatile that it is almost situational, so we're just throwing a lot of options at you guys. But moving on, there's one more shield we need to talk about. The metallic curtain is a magnetic field in front of where you are aiming, which absorbs all incoming enemy projectiles. This includes all types of projectiles, as well as hitscan shots, including but not limited to normal attacks, healing projectiles, special abilities, and even most ultimates. Yes, even massive ultimates like Iron Man's or another Magneto's. If the projectile touches the metallic curtain, it gets eaten. If you are watching this as an Overwatch player, you could liken it to D.Va's defense matrix, except instead of being a big thing, it's a flat thing in front of you. Unlike Doctor Strange's or most shields in the game, the metallic curtain doesn't have any type of health or a maximum amount of damage that it can take. It instead operates on a timer with sort of a stamina bar that charges up when it isn't in use. The shield works like other shields in the game in the sense that it actively is a wall. Not only do projectiles not go through it, but any abilities that require line of sight will also not have any effect on Magneto or any teammates behind the shield as long as the shield cuts that line of sight. Keep in mind, however, that if you are currently mid-air or if you're looking upwards enough where the bottom of your shield stops touching the ground, then an Iron Man or a Magneto ult at your feet has the chance of hitting you since the explosion now has a line of sight to your hitbox. The shield can be held for a maximum of 2 seconds at a time. It takes a second before it starts recovering after it's lowered and recovers at a rate of about 10% a second, meaning it takes 10 seconds to get a full charge if it's completely drained. And you can only activate the shield once every 3 seconds, so while you want to try to manage the amount of shield stamina you have remaining by toggling it off and on very, very fast, keep in mind that it just does not let you do that. It cannot be spammed. And just like with bubbles, cooldown and resource management will be key here. And if you're up against another Magneto, generally speaking, whoever ends up wasting their abilities or just don't use them optimally enough are usually the ones that lose the front line first, which means that they're going to be the ones to lose. With that in mind, realistically, you're not going to see yourself holding the shield up for the entire duration unless you're trying to keep yourself or a teammate safe from a massive threat that keeps hammering out damage, like Punisher. So I normally try to find a timing to use the shield right when it's needed and drop it as soon as I'm convinced I don't need to use it anymore. Any time spent needlessly holding the shield up is wasted seconds that I could have kept myself or a teammate safe farther down the line. As with most of Magneto's kits, the shield will end up having a near infinite amount of plays you can do with it, but some of my favorites include obviously keeping my shield up for my teammates, especially ones that use certain ultimates that require a lot of peel, for example, Punisher's ultimate or, even his turret, even though Invisible Woman does a pretty good job of it in Season 1. In the same vein, shielding off high damage abilities like Punisher's ultimate or his team up, while kiting backwards and having your team taking care of him will stop the brunt of the outgoing damage and completely nullify any damage coming back towards you as you don't really have any health. I also think that shielding off enemies can be very valuable, but at the same time, it's pretty niche. Basically, for those who don't know what this would mean, if an enemy ends up diving past our shield line, this puts him in front of our DPS, but also behind our front line or our shields. If I trust my backline enough and I know that they can kill the target fast enough, then instead of turning and shooting him or using any of my other abilities, I could just keep my shield up and block the enemy supports from healing their own divers, who then end up dying without any additional heals. But it really depends on the level of both teams, and there's a lot of trust involved. Something else I find a lot of use for is using the metallic curtain whenever I am frontlining alongside a Doctor Strange. Unlike Magneto, Doctor Strange has a health bar on his shield, and as a frontline, whichever Strange loses their shield first generally loses. But if there's a lot of incoming damage onto his shield, then I could turn on my metallic curtain and place it in front of Strange's shield to soak up the sudden burst of damage. If Doctor Strange somehow breaks before I can help him with this setup, then the metallic curtain can also be used as a temporary shield for a little while as Doctor Strange is getting his own shield back. Since the shield also eats any projectiles that touches it, much like the defense matrix for any Overwatch enjoyers out there, one underrated, but my favorite use for it is eating enemy ultimates. Magneto's usually try throwing their ultimate over my head, in which case I try to jump and catch it. Iron Man ult coming in, I catch it. If I know that there's a fight deciding ability, like Groot's, I will actively be on the lookout and stand in front of him, and if he pops his ultimate, I will catch it, which stops him from activating it in the first place. Overall, I consider the metallic curtain more of a temporary respite from anything scary, but obviously nothing as permanent as Doctor Strange's shield. I feel like a broken record, but as with all of your shields, you want to strike that perfect balance where you're using the shields perfectly, where they are up and available to help mitigate incoming enemy damage and stop ultimates, meaning you don't actually waste them by using them for no reason, but still, while you never find yourself in a situation where you're never using the shields at all, since by never using them and just having them sit fresh off cooldown the whole game, you also never deny the enemy fire, ult charge, and kills. As a general rule of thumb, I try to use the shield a little bit more than the barriers, just for a little while to soak up damage here and there, while still keeping that crucial stamina left on the shield if I need to pull it up again shortly afterwards. If I would have to make up a number, I would suggest avoiding to use more than half of your shield at a time, so you have something to work with if you suddenly have to pull your shield up and sustain a lot of damage, as dropping the shield would kill you or your teammates. As with all the other shields, a little bit of prediction in how your enemies and your teammates want to play goes a very long way. And finally, let's talk about Magneto's ultimate. Most players in the community seems to have written off this banger of an ability way too soon, but after watching this guide, hopefully you're gonna start getting some value out of it as well, because this big meatball has more types of value than just throwing a ball of damage into Doctor Strange's shield. Activating your ultimate starts building and charging a big meatball, while making Magneto start floating. Over the next 4 seconds, the damage of the ball scales from 100 at the start all the way to 300. The amount of time until the ball hits max charge is visible both from the size of the ball as well as through a circular loading bar around your crosshair. The ball will automatically be thrown towards the crosshair once the duration is up, with the explosion radius expanding from 5 meters up to 8. But keep in mind that accuracy is important, since while the explosion is big, the damage also falls off towards its outer edges, where it only deals half of its fully charged damage to enemies that that are over 6 meters away from the center. During the building phase, Magneto also creates a massive sphere surrounding him, and any incoming projectiles will be sucked into the meatball and add to its damage, with the charge of the ball being visible with these numbers under your crosshair. Every point adds an additional 3 damage to the total damage of the meatball, but be careful because if the charge exceeds 100, then the ball will instantly explode in your hands instead. This means that theoretically, if you suck up enough damage and throw the ball at the very end of the animation, it can let you deal 597 damage with a direct hit. Realistically though, depending on your lobbies, you should expect to get somewhere between 200 to 300 damage per ball, assuming you let the animation finish or you throw it right before it explodes. So as I mentioned, the meatball has several uses. As for throwing it, the best use will be trying to one-shot the backline or a high priority target with the meatball. Most tanks have shield abilities and most duelists will have ways to get out of the way, so your best bet most of the time will be trying to one-shot their supports. Obviously, knowing their abilities and cooldowns will help, but with the current meta, I've found a lot of success simply by sniping the Mantis, especially if she is in an ultimate or a Luna, as long as somebody has peeled off her over shields first. If I get a direct hit, then the amount of damage I soak up rarely matters, as long as it doesn't break the ball before it fully charges. And I understand there's a lot of loose numbers here, but I've actually done the math to help you guys figure out when you actually should throw the ball to secure some kills. So, from a little bit of testing, it does seem that the ball charge up damage is linear, meaning that over the 4 seconds it takes to finish the animation, the ball will charge 50 damage per second. This means that without any additional charge, the ball deals a little over 100 damage if thrown off rip. That means it deals 150 at 25%, 200 damage at the halfway point, 250 damage at the 75% mark, and of course, as I mentioned previously, 300 damage with a larger range if the animation finishes completely. On top of that, as I mentioned previously, it also charges 3 damage per point of energy soaked up. Keeping some of these numbers in mind and doing quick maths will help you figure out when you're good to one-shot a squishy. If you hold ult for too long, sure, you'll deal more damage, but the target usually manages to run away or get behind cover, so throwing right when the kill is guaranteed is the name of the game. Most heroes, supports, or squishies will hover in the 250 to 275 health range. To make things easier, I consider the ult a one-shot at 300 damage or more against these targets. The health of tanks will vary a lot, not to mention their additional shields or sustainabilities, but assuming that they are full health and you land a direct hit, then you won't be able to one-shot most tanks in Marvel Rivals, so I wouldn't even try it. So with all of this context, what are some key numbers you want to look out for? If we're aiming to hit that 300 damage mark with our ultimate to one-shot a squishy, then generally speaking, if you soak up no damage, then it will need to play the entire animation to actually one-shot the squishy targets. But letting it play the whole way might not always be optimal, because you might end up just soaking up a lot of damage off rip. So you can also hit the 300 damage mark by charging the meatball to 25% of the animation with 50 charge, to half of the animation with 34 charge, to 75% of the animation with 17 charge, or well, 100% of the animation without any charge. If you end up soaking up like 80 or 90 charge, it is almost always enough to one-shot a squishy, and you will rarely find yourself in a situation where you do get all of this charge in a short period of time, unless you're fighting a Punisher or Star-Lord mid-ultimate, in which case you can just return it to sender to get a free kill. But you have to throw it basically immediately, which is great and all if all you want to do is secure picks and snipe the squishies, and don't get me wrong, most of the time this will be enough and make a very big impact, but many players think that the Magneto ult only serves that one purpose, that being one-shotting squishies. But that's not entirely true, and in many ways you could consider the ultimate an extension of his entire kit. The higher you go up the ladder and the more the game's community matures, the better players will get at dodging the ball, which means you should expect to get less out of the damage part of the ball, but it definitely doesn't mean it can't have insane value. Because even if you don't kill a single person with the meatball, it still serves at least 2 major purposes. First, the ultimate is zoning. This is also something I tell myself every time I whiff it to feel better about myself. Enemies will generally run away or get to cover the second you pop your ultimate. Brave strangers might fly in your face, Punishers might even ult into the ball, and even if you don't get a kill, it still displaces the enemies, it throws them out of formation, and it makes them all focus you, which is kind of your job as a tank, since 6 people are looking at you and not at your teammates, who will have a complete free reign of the battlefield for a few seconds. The meatball obviously also eats all incoming damage, which can counterplay certain pesky ultimates, especially ones like Star-Lords, which can tear through most supports or squishies without them being able to do anything, without them burning their own support ults or big cooldowns. Not to mention that due to how Star-Lord's ultimate works, even if a counter Luna or Mantis ult does come out, then he can just shoot any enemy that happens to be out of position. If you're a Magneto Magneto and pop your ultimate, and you're positioned between Star-Lord and any teammates, which you usually are, then the Meatball eats his ult instead. If you're feeling brave, you could even try returning it to sender. Other than that, here are a few other great uses for Magneto's ult. Again, the possibilities are really endless. If we're thinking of the ultimate as an offensive tool, then some of my favorite uses include ulting forward with my team pushing alongside me. This helps clear enemies off the point or off other high grounds that we might be struggling to gain access to. If there's one troublesome enemy I need to get rid of, then this is an easy way to do so. Even if I don't get to kill them with the Meatball, just a threat will zone them away on its own. I've also been experimenting with my own styles of Meatballs, where instead of frontlining with the thing, I look for off angles to throw the enemies off guard. Ideally, you want to pop the ultimate when you and your team is pushing up, and then fly around some cover or take a small flank route, which helps you get a free angle on the enemies. It really only works if they fall back when getting pushed, but man, when it works great. In the same vein, I'm experimenting with cross-map Meatball tosses. I guess I would call these something like free pointers, but so far I haven't really pulled one off. Time will tell though, and by having it in your arsenal, maybe you guys can do something cool with it. You can also throw a Meatball into Doctor Strange's shield if there's nothing else to throw it at. Sure, you won't get any kills, and some might think you look stupid, but assuming he's taken some damage, then Doctor Strange's shield will be completely shattered, which might be enough for your team to push in and win the fight. It's a very low reward play, but it's better than nothing. One of the best ways to use the ultimate though will be countering enemy plays. Many ults or pushes can be countered by Magneto ult used the right way. For example, a fully charged 300 damage Magneto ult will one-shot an ulting Mantis, and just like that, their entire valuable support ultimate is gone. A full animation Meatball with about 80 charge will also be enough to instantly one-shot an ulting Luna Snow. Again, just completely countering an otherwise very pesky ultimate. I love using my Meatball when the enemies are starting to roll in, and I sometimes try to wait as long as possible before doing it to ensure that they invest as many ults as possible into the fights, just to make them lose and ruin their ult economy when they inevitably get smacked with that massive Swedish Meatball. If you think of the ultimate as a defensive ultimate, then here are some great defensive uses. The Meatball can eat massive projectiles such as Iron Man's, which gives 80 charge. This means that if these ultimates are coming in but you aren't able to protect your teammates with your other shields, then popping your ultimate can let you yoink these big balls and throw them away. If you didn't have any energy prior, then you're already near the 300 damage limit after eating one of these projectiles, meaning you can throw it right back at the Iron Man or supports to kill them instantly. The Meatball can also act as a very strong counter against Punisher, but it is really a game of chicken. On its own, Punisher's ultimate pops the Meatball in probably less than a second, so if he starts shooting at you, then you practically will need to throw that Meatball immediately. But Punishers who do this are generally not well protected enough and lack the movement abilities to get out of the way, so throwing the ultimate right back at them will generally kill them. I also like using the ultimate as a way to turn fights rather than to initiate them. If the enemies get some massive stun ultimates off, like let's say Doctor Strange's or even Groot's, and I didn't get caught, especially if I shielded myself, then I found that you can pop the Magneto ult and practically stop the enemies from actually blowing your team up. Even if they do kill one or two of your own, then you still brought your teammates enough space and health to keep fighting, and with a well-placed Meatball, then you might even be able to turn the fight back in your favor. On another note, I've also used the ultimate to get back after getting thrown off the map, but this is super niche and really only something you would use in the last fight when you know you wouldn't have time to get back, or you just want to farm a clip or something. I don't know. Oh, and also, Magneto can slowly glide or hover downwards by holding the jump after getting some air. It doesn't really serve much of a purpose, but can be used to throw enemies off. For example, if you're jumping off a high ground, then you could keep hovering while shooting down at them, which might throw them off guard if they're expecting you to be on the point with them. You can also hold the hover after your Meatball throw is finished, but the benefit is negligible because of the animation lock after the throw, kind of forcing you to fall down a little bit before it can be activated. Also, something I didn't really mention until now is Magneto's team up. At the time of this video, he has a team up ability with Scarlet Witch, which lets him change his primary to a cool sword slash for 10 seconds. Hitting your primary fire with this active will send a projectile out that deals 85 damage to the first target it hits, while also adding 30 additional damage to any targets within 3 meters. Whether you use it or not, the powered up slashes disappear after 10 seconds. The 85 damage is pretty juicy since it lowers the amount of hits needed to kill a 250 health target, so the breakpoints will change. With your primary fire, you would need 4 hits, but with the slash, you would only need 3. If you do get this team up, using that team up off of cooldown at any point during the fight is ideal, especially since it doesn't have any damage fall off, meaning you can snipe targets across all ranges, and the cleave damage is a pretty nice bonus since it lets you deal a lot of damage to grouped up targets as well. That being said, I wouldn't force a DPS to play Scarlet Witch for the team up, but hey, if you have it, why not use it, right? But that was all for the abilities, but I still want to add a few pointers that I think are very important for willing Magneto players out there. First, we have some picks. Now, this will obviously be patch and meta reliant, but generally speaking, I think it's safe to say that a Magneto fills the role of an off-tank. If you have a Doctor Strange, in many cases, he would benefit from having a Magneto on his team as well to help with frontline pressure. When Magneto plays the off-tank role, he will generally want to be positioned between the main tank and the supports, being able to help either side, whichever needs it. If you and your team is pushing forward, generally speaking, Magneto wants to be next to his main tank, but if you are getting pushed, depending on the situation, then Magneto wants to be between his DPS and his supports and the enemy. Again, it really comes down to the situation, but hopefully this gives you an idea of where you want to be positioned. If you're playing in Diamond and above and Doctor Strange is banned, which happens quite a lot, then Magneto can step up and play as main tank himself, though it is a bit scuffed and requires you to use your shield proactively to cover your teammates a lot more often. In this case, you'll be on the front line yourself, but you're gonna need to play cover a decent amount not to get blown up, since your shield doesn't tank against sustained damage over time the same way Doctor Strange's would. If you're playing into a dive composition that wants to keep jumping your supports, then usually you'll want to play close to them and make sure to have shields ready once the enemy team actually commits. I wouldn't say Magneto has any direct counters on his own, especially since his whole kit revolves around shutting down other plays. Though, if anything, I would argue that his main counter could be a Doctor Strange, especially if there's a tank v tank situation, since not only does main tank related activities better, but he also has the ability to fly in Magneto's face and deny the meatball from hitting any meaningful targets. Obviously, Wolverine will be a problem most of the time, but Magneto can use his bubble to kind of save any yoink teammates or himself if Wolverine tries to do a big play. It's also a bit more difficult, but not impossible, to get value out of Magneto if you're playing against melee heavy matchups, since charging your ultimate will be harder, and since melee pierces shields, realistically only your barriers will be the way to save your teammates. As for your ultimate, remembering how much charge you need to get your one shot is important here, since you can oftentimes still make that ultimate work even if the enemies don't charge it up. As for maps, I would argue that Magneto is pretty valuable on all maps and modes, though he especially shines on convergence and convoy maps, both for the additional space and sustain that he provides his team, as well as the natural ways that he can use the meatball to clear space or shut down animal combos on his own so the team can stay on the point. Domination is a bit more chaotic, but obviously making Magneto work here isn't impossible if you approach each fight like you would a fight on convergence or convoy, where there is a clear attacker and a clear defender. You can sustain and survive a push, but ideally I would argue you might want to be the one to initiate. But anyways, I hope all this helps. As I said, I've been playing a lot of Magneto, so I figured I'd share what I know so far. If you guys want more guides, make sure that you do subscribe and let me know in the comments what you want to see next. I have a lot of really cool content lined up, including a lot more solo to Grandmaster streams, followed by videos of that, and then of course guides for those specific heroes, and I cannot wait to go over those with you guys. If you guys want to get even better at Marvel Rivals, check out the video on the screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Peace out.